and I know you can all see this. It's called the No Dairy Breast Cancer Prevention Program by a woman named Jane Plant. That's really her name, Jane Plant. She's not a plant in any sense of the word. And Jane Plant is one of the most distinguished female scientists in the history of Great Britain. She's written several books. She's written many, many articles. She's a chief scientist of the British Geological Survey. And in 1987, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And after 5 operations in which she lost all of one breast and half of the other breast, and she went through chemotherapy and radiation therapy and 5 different surgeries, she was still told that she had at most 6 months to live. She was still in her 50s, and she had a tumor growing in her neck. Her cancer had spread from her breast to her neck. When you have breast cancer, if it stays in your breast, it usually doesn't kill you. It's when it spreads, and she had this tumor growing in her neck. When they biopsied it, it was breast cancer tissue, and that tumor was going to kill her, and there was nothing else they could do to save her life. And she decided to spend those last few months of her life trying to figure out why she might have gotten this disease. And she said, as a geologist, she didn't have the luxury of doing a study where they feed one group one thing and one group something else and see what happens over the next few months. She says, as a geologist, she's trained in looking at rock formations and trying to figure out what happened over the last 1,000,000 years and where the coal might be and where the oil might be and so on. And so she traveled around the world in those last few months she had left, and she kept looking at countries where breast cancer was a rare disease compared to countries where breast cancer was a common disease, like Great Britain and the United States and Western Europe. And it kept coming back to her again and again that dairy products seemed to make a big difference. In China, where there was traditionally been no dairy industry and very few people used dairy products, they called breast cancer rich woman's disease, because only the women that can afford to eat a Western type diet and travel a lot ever seem to get it. But now China is developing a dairy industry, and the breast cancer rates are going up tremendously. But anyway, Jane Plant gave up dairy products, gave up all animal products to see if that would make a difference. And she noticed that within a few weeks, the tumor in her neck started to itch, and then it started to shrink. And then when she went back to her doctor 6 months later, instead of being dead, she was totally cancer-free. And just from giving up animal products. And she looked back in the literature, and she found a study that had been published in the British Journal of Cancer, right where she lived. The British Journal of Cancer in 1970 published a study saying that breast cancer rates were much higher in the areas of England where milk drinking was much more common. And it didn't matter whether it was full-fat milk or skim milk, because the milk itself has these growth hormones in it, which are proteins. And she was very upset that none of her doctors ever mentioned that study. And what she found out was that the dairy industry, every time a study comes out condemning dairy products as being a likely link to cancer, the dairy industry hires somebody else saying, oh, more research is needed. We needn't publicize this yet. And of course, they have hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising money to buy their way into the front page of the paper. So Jane Plant was cancer-free. She talked to about 80 other women that she'd been going through chemotherapy and radiation therapy with, and every one of them that changed their diet the way she did seemed to do much better, and the few that didn't want to change their diet seemed to do much worse, or they died. And so she wrote this book, the No Dairy Breast Cancer Prevention Program. But when this book came out, it didn't sell very well. I'm sure many of you have never seen it, because people look at the cover of this book and they say, no dairy. Well, you know, maybe my breast cancer rate might go down in a few years, but my bones are going to fall apart next week if I don't have milk to drink. And it's like telling people not to breathe because the air is polluted. Well, if you don't breathe, you're going to die of asphyxiation. People think if you don't drink milk, you're going to die of this bone disease. And so she went, when the publisher said, we've got to change the cover of this book because people just don't want to buy it when they see those first 3 words, no dairy, that the hardcover edition of this book looks like this. This book is called Your Life in Your Hands, Understanding, Preventing, and Overcoming Breast Cancer. Not a word about dairy or no dairy on it. It's exactly the same book, word for word, page for page. And this book you'll find on library shelves. This book you won't find because it's too radical. It's the same book. If you go to the Cancer Society, they'll have this book on the shelf. They won't have this one. They don't read the books, but they don't want to lose their funding from the dairy industry, so they'll only have this innocent-looking book called Your Life in Your Hands. And yet it's the same book that talks about how these growth hormones, and she identifies about 15 different growth hormones in milk and dairy products that have been identified as being associated with raising breast cancer rates. As a matter of fact, there's one hormone in milk called prolactin, and the way they measure how much prolactin is in the milk is they put a drop of the milk onto a petri dish with cancer cells from a rat, and how much those cancer cells grow tells them how much prolactin is in the milk. That's what these growth hormones do, is they promote growth.